You know, I mean, I honestly thought LG was going to be one of the top TVs this year. I mean, everyone, before we really got the TVs in house, or any of the reviewers did, a lot of people were saying that they thought the G5 was probably going to win this year, probably knock off the A9, the A95L or the Bravia 8 Mark II. But
podcast.
Welcome to the eCoustics podcast. This is Brian Mitchell, your host and founder of eCoustics.com. This episode is all about the best of the best 2025 TVs to find out who would be crowned king of TVs in this year's Value Electronics TV Shootout, where the top of the line 65-inch OLED 4K TVs went head to head. That would be the LG G5, Panasonic Z95B, Samsung S95F, and the Sony Bravia 8 Mark II. And if all that wasn't a mouthful, let's try to keep it simple and just refer to these TVs as the brand name only. So Sony, Samsung, LG, Panasonic should make it simpler. But before we dive into the details and find out who won and why, I'm honored to welcome Brandon, but you know him best as popular YouTuber Be The Installer, who has reviewed hundreds of TVs over the last 5 years, earning him 255,000 subscribers and over 90 million views from 388 videos. Boy, is that impressive. Welcome, Brandon. We're grateful you could join us, and we're very interested to get your thoughts on this year's TV Shootout.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate being here. This was an interesting event, to say the least. I think this is my third TV Shootout. I went in 21 and 22 down at the company, I believe the building down in New York City. And this was my first time both being at Value Electronics and the Shootout up there, of course. So it was kind of cool. And of course, I wanted to see Value Electronics in its full glory, but they had it, covered in, was it Duvertine? Is that the fabric?
Maybe.
And yeah. Where they have the black fabric everywhere. And like they use literally TV boxes to kind of like black it out and make sure that Chris and the other judges could have perfect environment for scoping out these TVs. They also had the TV boxes up covering all the windows. So very good use of all the resources. And overall, I thought it was a really cool event. And, was I upset that the winner won? No. At the same time, I could have seen a couple different TVs get first place. So overall, I think it was a very close race, and I was happy to be part of it.
And we are also joined by our editor-at-large, Chris Boylan, who was a judge at this year's Shootout, one of 9 judges who painstakingly judged every TV set by set, side by side. And Chris has attended these for decades. But what was different?
Decades.
Well, over a decade. But what was different in this year's competition?
It was pretty similar to years past, but I think the big difference was not including anything but OLED. I think in previous years, when OLEDs and mini LED LCD TVs have been included, the performance difference, even between the worst OLED and the best mini LED, was still there. The way that they do these testings, primarily in a dark room, the brightness advantages of a mini LED LCD TV really don't matter as much, right? So they chose to focus just on the OLEDs, and there are 4 different OLEDs that all had a very different kind of look and different characteristics. So I think it was good. It still went so much longer than I thought it would, but I mean, every year just things happen and it gets long. And today was a nice hot day, the event a couple days ago was a nice hot day with very poor air conditioning. So toward the end, I think most of us were ready to go.
Well, I think the big story is not about who won, but how and why, and the whole thing went down. But should I spoil a surprise for the people that don't know who won? I think we might as well get that out of the way. Sony won for the 7th year in a row.
Wow.
So congratulations.
Yeah.
Congratulations to Sony for the top of the line OLED. Won again, but it was a razor tight finish. They won by 0.03 of a point over Samsung.
Mm-hmm. And then another couple hundredths down to the Panasonic. So those top 3 were really close. And I think each one could shine in a different use case. So I think they're all winners, right? I mean, you hate to say something trite like that, but depending on what you want it for, any one of those 3 really put in a strong performance. The LG, not as much. I think it's got some issues with processing that really kind of showed up. And I was a bit surprised at its performance at the event.
Any thoughts on the LG? I know you've seen that one before the event. You saw it again at the event. Did that one surprise you in some way, Brandon?
I mean, I honestly thought LG was going to be one of the top TVs this year. I mean, everyone, before we really got the TVs in-house, or any of the reviewers did, a lot of people were saying that they thought the G5 was probably going to win this year, probably knock off the the A95L or the Bravia 8 Mark II. But, I haven't had it in-house. I've seen it a couple times. It looked great. But at the same time, I trust the judges who are up in front of the TVs. So yeah, it was surprising for sure that it just got crushed. I mean, like losing by a half a point overall in a 5-point system, is pretty significant. It looked like it came in last on a lot of the different scores. And at the same time, the other three were almost so close. You could have sneezed and, another one would have won. So, we can talk more about the scores really, but there was a couple things. I know, Chris, you were, part of it, but I mean, a couple scores or a couple categories where one of the top three TVs was marked down or marked higher pretty significantly, that then ended up looking like it became the difference, like the 60p content for the Samsung, for example, that ended up scoring, I think, out of the box kind of categories or motion, whatever it was. There was a category in which it was a half point behind the Sony in just that one category that ended up probably making a huge difference when the scores were within 0.03 of a point overall. If you lose a half a point, or if you're pretty far behind in the Samsung on that 60p content, then you basically shot Samsung in the foot. Like they weren't, they would have won by 1/10 or 0.2 of a point if that hadn't been deducted. I mean, I think some people were giving that like a 3 in that motion instead of a 5. So it's like,
so you were saying 60p content? Is that what you were saying? This was a 60 frames per second test?
Yeah, I could be incorrect in how I say it, but it sounded like they had to add or remove additional like motion interpolation for the Samsung only, because it was literally unable to, smooth out the motion for 60p. It was like making it pretty jerky. I know that I've had issues with Samsungs for the same reason, and it's a 3-2 pull down or some sort of issue with their motion. And then, so with that said, were they giving it a pass or fail grade on that? Right. And is that the way that they were supposed to score that? Because other categories were incremental 0.5. So if you're giving it a 3 of 5, let's say, just for that motion, that significantly changes the overall score, because it then got last place in that motion or second to last. And it's just like, it was just very difficult to catch the Sony after that. Lights turned on, the bright room content kind of stuff. I'm not sure where it was scored that way, because it doesn't look like it on the scoreboard here. But, in the motion, and it might have been the processing, the 3.66 for SDR, the 3.72 for processing in HDR. But those scores really hurt the Samsung.
And I think that speaks to an issue, which is, this year there were probably 3 or 4 new judges, myself included. I've been to the event enough in the past that I know the general feeling of how you score these things, right? And you don't score something a 1 out of 5 because it fails one test. Unless it does so egregiously that you're just like, this looks terrible, right? So I know that on that one, the 60p motion test, where there was a little bit of judder, or what looked like judder, looked like what you said, 3-2 pull down, but there is no 3-2 pull down when you go from 60 to 60 or 60 to 120, right? It's an even match, but that's what the artifact looked like. I didn't ding it that much for that, but I can't speak for the other judges. If they thought they're supposed to go to these extremes, maybe like, oh, that failed, let's give it a 2 or a 3, and that one passed, so let's give it a 5. I think there probably was a little bit of a variation in the judging to that extent, and that probably would have affected things. But you would think if there's only 1 or 2 judges out of 9 that are making those kinds of extremes, and it probably didn't affect the overall composite scores that much, one would think. But also on a similar point, Sony did really well in SDR tests, and that really took the day. I hate watching SDR. I love when that Dolby Vision logo comes up, or at least some kind of HDR, HDR10, HDR10 Plus. A lot of the stuff on streaming and on Blu-ray disc is HDR content. That to me is more important than, like, say, broadcast stuff, which may not or may be in HDR. A lot of the sports these days are actually broadcasting in HDR. But some of the legacy stuff, news, older shows, streaming, may not have HDR. And when it doesn't, the Sony definitely looked better. And I think that made the difference, certainly in those 300ths of a point. For me, the Panasonic, which did better on HDR, might be my choice over the Sony, possibly. Again, depending on use case. But the Sony has a lot of really strong features that I love too. The DTS:X on Disney Plus and on Sony Pictures Core, things that you can't do on the other TVs. So Sony, is a strong performer too.
So I think we should at least talk about some of the setup, how everything was arranged. There were 4 TVs side by side, and in between 2 of the TVs was a Sony reference broadcast monitor, which served as the reference point. You're supposed to be comparing reference to what you were seeing on the screens. And I do want to let Chris, because Chris was a judge there and got to check mark or rate all of these. And I think there were 8 categories, 4 SDR, standard dynamic range, and 4 HDR high dynamic range categories. And then there were even subcategories within that weren't part of the overall published results. So Chris, could you maybe talk about the judging and maybe a little bit of the calibration that happened before you even started?
Yeah. So there were initially on the scorecard, there were 8 categories for SDR and 8 for HDR. And as the event progressed, some of those categories were consolidated, particularly toward the end when it was getting late and we'd been there a long time and we're all hot and sweaty. I think they folded a couple of the categories into one. I don't know if that would have impacted the actual overall scores too much. We did still rate each individual category from 1 to 5 with half-point increments. And we were specifically instructed to compare each TV, not to each other, but to the Sony broadcast reference monitor. And again, some people might think that gives Sony an unfair advantage because they make the monitor as well. But the Sony professional division is fairly separate from the Sony consumer division. And also this $47,000 reference monitor is the one that almost all the studios use when they're mastering content from movies to home, right? So the director is looking at things on that monitor and saying, yep, that looks the way that I want it to look when it gets into people's homes. So if we're trying to be true to the artistic expression, right, of the directors and the filmmakers, all the people who put it together, then it kind of makes sense to say, how well does this consumer monitor or display match up to a professional reference display? And yes, Sony won. Sony did have the picture that was gauged to be most accurate, closest to the reference. But in some parts of the testing, they threw the reference out the window. Well, not technically because it's $47,000 TV, but they turned them off when they're doing things like out-of-the-box picture settings because Sony Professional Reference Monitor doesn't have a consumer setting like dynamic or vivid or cinema mode, right? They're all professionally geared. So when we were looking at out-of-the-box settings and bright room performance, they turned off the reference monitor and we were really just comparing each of those TVs to each other and judging what we thought looked best for the content, what looked most natural, most dynamic, most accurate, based on our experience of seeing these things in reality, right? So it wasn't 100% just compared to the reference monitor, but that was most of it, right? They frowned upon you looking at 2 TVs side by side with each other, which is why they put the reference monitor in between them both and said, compare it back to the reference and gauge, these scores based on what you see happening on the reference monitor.
Okay, so the calibration was a key part for at least 90% of the ratings.
Yeah.
I'd say it was against a calibrated, and there was a calibrator that came in. How much time was it the same calibrator doing all TVs, or how was that done? And was there like the calibration report given to people in advance to know how close it got to the reference?
No, they didn't share that. And it was Dwayne Davis who calibrated all the TVs. He's been doing this for years. He's not in-house because he's independent, but when you buy a TV from Value Electronics and you pay a little extra to have it calibrated, Dwayne is normally the guy who does that calibration before it gets shipped off to a customer. So he's got years of experience. He's a top-notch calibrator. He knows what he's doing. the TVs were calibrated to 100 nits peak brightness for SDR content, which is correct, right? It's an accurate way of doing things, but then any brightness advantage of the TV is not going to stand out. Sony was actually one of the least bright TVs in terms of its peak white bright, luminance values on a 5 or 10% window. But it dominated in the SDR competition because it was accurate and its processing was great and the color reproduction was great. But it didn't do as well on the HDR tests. But still, it was so far ahead in the SDR that it ended up winning the whole event.
So I know, Brandon, you had separately, prior to the event, you had reviewed the Sony and the Samsung. Was there anything that happened at the event that surprised you about those particular models that were different than some of your in-home testing when you had those TVs?
I mean, I don't typically get into like specific tests that are, with numeric values per se. Like I don't really calibrate the TVs. It's more a feel for me and the channel and kind of, what I think is important, maybe different than exact, creator intent and how the TV's output. But at the same time, my feel typically is in line with how the TVs perform. And I'm pretty good at kind of like guesstimating what TVs are going to come out. And just kind of like hearing thoughts of both the Panasonic from overseas in years past to how it's performed this year. I wasn't surprised that the Sony and the Panasonic did fairly well and even. I was a little more surprised that the Samsung scored so high and was so close to winning. Just because in my experience, specifically out of the box, Samsung TVs can be a little wild and kind of just all over the place. And so the fact that it was able to be calibrated to, the point that it was this competitive and almost won this was very interesting to me. And I thought, in my opinion, the Panasonic seemed the most kind of just even across all the categories, from at least sitting back a little further. I wasn't right up in front of the TVs. I went up there occasionally here and there, but I just found the Panasonic and the Sony to be what I felt was most consistent from 10 feet away throughout the day. And when I had the Sony in-house, I thought the Sony was every bit as good as the A95L and brighter. So I thought it was a great TV. SDR and brightness and how it was kind of docked earlier in the year for not being as bright, and then SDR, HDR both. I couldn't really feel that at home. Again, it probably would be something you'd notice when you have two TVs side by side more so than just one in the house. But, I have an A95L as my main TV in my bedroom. So am I biased? Probably more so for little things like the Google TV and the remote and how nice it sounds, without a soundbar, things like that, not necessarily picture quality. But to Chris's point earlier, Sony TVs for SDR processing is amazing. How it upscales lower, bitrate content. Like I watch a lot of sports, and I have a lot of TVs, especially like a Samsung, the S95F. It just could not display the sports very well and was getting crushed when we would try to put sports on it. And the Sony just smooths it out so well. It's pretty amazing. With the same panel more or less, and then the processing so much different.
Right. I mean, I think that's another part of this story is Sony and Samsung have the same panel, and LG and Panasonic have the same panel technology, and they're different. I'll let Chris talk about some of the differences of the panel. And Chris.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting to see that Panasonic is apparently doing better things with the quad stack tandem RGB panel than LG is. And yes, LG Display and LG Consumer or LG Electronics are different divisions of the same company, but you would have expected LG to have maybe more of an advantage there, since they might, you would think, have a little longer time or more experience with that panel. But it comes down to processing, like Brandon was saying. It's how good how can you optimize the panel itself for the input signal that's coming in? And when you have content that isn't awesome, how can you make it look better? And in the case of the HDR content, you're never going to be able to match. Maybe someday you will on an OLED to be able to do full 4,000 nit peak brightness, and you won't have to worry about tone mapping. But for now, when there is content that's mastered for a 4,000 nit peak, None of the TVs that we have right now can really reach that. The max is about 2,500 at the moment. Of course, mini LED TVs can hit that 4,000, but they weren't in the competition, right?
Right.
So, and on the flip side, again, Sony is taking Samsung Display's panel and doing very good things with it that looked different from the way that the Samsung was treating it. But I think more of a difference, and the reason that I was a little surprised that the Samsung did well, is that matte finish that they applied on top of the screen. A lot of purists, myself included, last year in the S95B, like, nope, can't live with that, because you put it in a bright room and it diffuses the light so much that it looks like, the beautiful blacks all turn gray. They've made some really good improvements in that matte finish this year, which minimizes that diffraction that screws up the black levels. But it's when I started looking at the panels off axis, and I included a picture of this in my coverage, when they opened the light, they opened the shades and they turned on the lights. I was looking at the Panasonic from the side, and I could see a very clear mirror reflection of the street outside, the buildings across the street, the bushes. It was literally like looking in a mirror. I moved over to the Samsung, and it was gone. It was literally gone. Yes, the black level was raised a little bit, but I think most people would find that clear reflection a lot more distracting than a raise of the black level. So yeah, there's a fix. Turn off the lights, close the drapes, everything looks fine. But I think that impressed me, seeing that TV against all the others, and the matte finish didn't really impact the quality of the viewing in a dark room, and it had some strong advantages in a bright room.
No, that's a really good point that you brought up, is the bright room viewing, which was one of the categories. But this was an odd category because you mentioned in your story on the website that this was a comparison in non-calibrated out-of-the-box mode, where they turned off the reference monitor, reset all the settings, is my understanding, and then did an out-of-the-box bright room. And the Samsung clearly won that.
Actually, no, the Samsung was slightly behind the Panasonic in bright room viewing, but it was like within a hundredth of a point or something.
Yeah, it depends on. Yeah, it's very odd that Samsung clearly won in the HDR bright room, but then didn't win in the SDR, which was odd, considering it has that anti-reflective coating. You would think it would surely win a bright room contest.
Yeah, and like you said, it did win HDR, but the Panasonic looked better in SDR. And maybe it has to do with the content that we were watching, because it was different. Obviously, some content is not available in HDR, and we watched it in SDR, and different content was available in HDR. So some of the tests and the content that we looked at, again, might have been different enough that it is a little perplexing to me that the bright room performance in SDR and HDR is different on the
because I think, maybe Brandon, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're going to recommend a bright room TV, it's probably going to be the Samsung, one of the Samsung models. Would that, or how would you? Maybe that's not true.
I mean, I think that anti-glare finish or glare-free finish is a contributor. I have done a couple installs in which people have asked me for a TV that was really good in a bright room, and I did choose that for that reason. And I replaced an older OLED TV with that S95D Chris was speaking about, and it looked so nice in that room. And, the S95F is better. I have had it in my room where there's light coming from an angle, and if you get a lot of light coming from an angle and you're sitting the other angle, it really changes the way that the TV looks, because it does, wash out the whole picture, kind of like a mid-tier Sony would with a matte finish or whatever back in the day. But at the same time, there is an advantage. And I do think that if you're in and it depends on how bright the room is, because if you're talking really bright, if you're talking like there's windows everywhere, all these TVs are going to be challenged during the day, realistically, just because the ambient light in the room is just so significantly increased that a mini LED TV like, the Bravia 9 or whatever UX from Hisense or any of these, QM8 from TCL, they just look a lot better, especially with SDR, I would say. Because when you're watching SDR, you just have full screen brightness that's higher when watching sports and cables and stuff. I think if you're going to watch a movie, you're probably going to turn the lights off and you're going to look for specular highlights. And so I don't know if full screen brightness is quite as important as specular highlights possibly, but I don't know. That could be wrong. It's just my opinion.
So as you bring up the HDR, I think this is another key thing that maybe people are complaining about is only regular HDR content was used, not HDR10. Sorry, HDR10 content was used, not HDR10 Plus, and not Dolby Vision content because all the TVs supported it somewhat differently. So that content was excluded, and some of those TVs may have performed a lot better had they been given that advantage. So having that left out and having it be such a big part of everyone's viewing experience, does that nullify the results in some way? Who wants to take that one?
Well, maybe Chris can give his professional opinion first. I can give my, layman term, opinion second, maybe.
Okay. So yes, Dolby Vision and HDR10 Plus can create better content because of dynamic metadata that's stored that really helps to map the content, the wide color gamut and the dynamic range content to the specific capabilities of the TV and change from a frame to frame basis. So it makes more of an optimized picture. So it does lead to a better HDR experience. But that said, only the Panasonic supports both HDR10 Plus and Dolby Vision. The reference monitors, as far as I know, don't support Dolby Vision. Could be wrong about that, but I don't think they do. So it would be hard to find a reference point, and I'm sure the comments are going to call me out if I was wrong on that. But it would be hard to find identical content that's available in both HDR10 Plus and Dolby Vision. And setting that up to watch it, you couldn't really compare the Samsung and the Sony, for example, to each other, because one would have to have the content in HDR10 Plus and the other would have to have it in Dolby Vision. So it makes it difficult to evaluate from a standpoint of this versus that. But it doesn't mean that it's not important. I think a lot of buyers see it as a checklist item. They see all this content on Amazon and on Netflix and other services that's available in Dolby Vision, and they think, I got to have that, right? This year, HDR10 Plus has come onto more and more services. I think it's available on Amazon. I think it's available on Netflix. It's definitely available on more than 3 or 4 of the top streaming services. So it's not as much of a negative, of a disadvantage to Samsung to not have Dolby Vision. But it certainly is an advantage to Panasonic to have both. Because that means no matter what you're watching, on streaming, on physical media, on Kaleidoscope, you're going to see that content, that HDR content, in the best possible light because it's supporting that dynamic layer of the metadata and it's able to do more with that content and optimize it better for the panel. That's my opinion.
Brandon?
Yeah. And for me, it's kind of similar, not quite as nuanced, but I can say it this way. You're going to have to kind of, I guess, compare to the lowest point if they can't all do the same thing, right? Like you're going to have to make choices. Do I think it's definitely not awesome that Samsung can't do Dolby Vision. If I'm watching a movie, I'd like to watch it in Dolby Vision if it's available. But then again, if I watch it on a Samsung and I watch it on an Apple TV, for example, and it's HDR10 Plus, it's fine. It looks just fine. And I can quit complaining about it. But then you're starting to say, well, if it can't do Dolby Vision and we're going to mark it down for that, then are we going to start marking things down that maybe the operating system isn't as good here, or remote isn't as good here, or the speakers aren't as good there, or the stand. And then you've got a long list of things that you could actually consider with regards to the differences in the TV. But then again, is this about that, or is it about how close these TVs are to perfection with regards to its picture quality? And so I guess that's kind of, a slippery slope if you're going to talk about all these different things.
Right. So we're trying to get to King of TVs, but in the King of TVs, we're only talking about mostly darkroom picture viewing. We're not talking about all the stuff you just mentioned, usability, remotes, features, all that
and
extra
that
stuff.
And that stuff ends up being really important for consumers when they're actually picking a TV, because any of the 4 TVs that are on this list are remarkable, and it's like, in the end, there's going to be so many more things that people price, availability, size, all that stuff. So it's the King of TV picture quality, right? Or compared to reference monitor is kind of what this is.
But we're also talking about only 65-inch models.
That's another thing
this
right
is
there.
another big thing. And the crazy part about it is Sony doesn't make a larger model. of their.
Well, they do, but it's not not the Bravia II. It's the A95L. It's still active in the line.
And and if you want to go higher than 83 or 83 in any of these models, you switch into a different panel technology than what's in the 65-inch TVs that were part of this shootout. So you can't even extrapolate higher than 65 inches fairly, because the panels shift, even though the model numbers stay the same. And this is in the Samsung and LG, and Panasonic doesn't make a larger than 77, I think. Well,
Panasonic hasn't even shown the 77 yet, but I think the plan is for that to become available. If you look on Amazon, et cetera, I think they only have 55 and 65 foot so far. But last I checked with them, at least, they were still planning on a 77. I wouldn't be that surprised if Sony came out with a 77 of this, now that it's the king of TV again. But maybe they have too much inventory of the A95L and the 77-inch still on hand at dealers. It's pure speculation on my part. But if they're going to continue, we all know Sony's going to be pushing for RGB, LED, LCD TVs probably early next year. We'll see probably a production version at CES this year.
Right.
But I think they have to keep OLED alive, because OLED still does some things better than even RGB and mini LED TVs can do. And I wouldn't be surprised, again, if there's a 77 at some point in the future.
Well, I've said this on other podcasts that I think most people want the larger TV sizes now. They want 85, they want 98. Brandon's reviewed the 116-inch Hisense, I think, and the 115-inch TCL, and the crazy size TVs. Do you think those TVs should be a larger size category at the shootout, or we're kind of getting into just all kinds of complications when you want to compare larger TVs against larger TVs? Brandon, I'll let you take that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if there should be a shootout for mini LED, OLEDs, all these other things. You can clearly see a shift in like Hisense and TCL going toward these larger screens. And I think they're looking at it as, bigger is better, at least in America here. I know a lot of people like big TVs, a lot of foreign markets. I know there is some demand for it, but, I don't know, we seem to have the larger lit dwelling spaces for TVs like this. And I think they're great. And I'm very impressed at how good, the 115-inch QM7K that I have is. It's remarkable. We were just watching a movie last night. I was like, this is incredible how good it looks. It really was. Watching Sicario. I don't know if you guys have seen that movie. I was like in awe, and I'm like, it's a $15,000 TV, but even the 98-inch version is $3,000. So it's like, to get a screen that large and the increased brightness over a projector UST or whatever, in comparison, you'd have to buy like a, 5-digit projector to throw that's going to get nearly that bright. So I do think that larger TVs are great. I wouldn't even know where to begin if they should have another competition for that. So I don't know, man.
You're still tired from the last one, right?
I am definitely tired. I didn't have to judge. I chose not to judge, both because I feel like I may be underqualified to see the nuances in some of these things, to be honest. But also, it is a lot of work, and you guys put in a lot, and it's very tedious to judge those for what was supposed to be 3 or 4 hours that turned into 10 hours again. So,
yeah. Chris, talk about some of the judging. 10 hours of staring at these TVs, and what were some of the patterns and test things, and was it real world? Was it test patterns? Like how? Talk about how you judged it.
So I think that was done pretty well, although it could have been trimmed, probably quite a bit. What they did was show us a test pattern so that we could see the kinds of artifacts or behavior or performance, whatever, that we were trying to identify in real world content. But we were told not to judge the TV based on the test pattern alone, but only on how that manifests itself in real world content. Right? So they'd show us some coming out of black tests where it's a grayscale that's going from dark gray to light gray, and where it is on the scale, and is it blinking at 65 or is it still visible at 64? And there's a lot of techie stuff that goes into that based on these test patterns. But then after that was done, after we saw that the yellow was not looking correct on this TV and the red was not looking correct on that one, they'd bring up a clip from a movie and say, take a look, usually freeze frame on a particular frame, and say, look in this areas of the screen. And if you see these types of artifacts, then that would probably impact the score, right? So we were led in the direction of what to look for, but not told how to judge it, right? So if I didn't see an artifact that they were saying is plain as day, I wouldn't ding it, because if I don't see it, I'm not going to score it. I did see it in the test pattern, and it was, subtle or maybe not so subtle in the test pattern, but in some of the real world content, it was really hard to spot these differences. And I'm not going to lie to say that, I think maybe I was a little more generous on a couple of those scores because, again, you're splitting hairs on some of this stuff. Not everything. Right. Some of them, there was clearly an issue. There was one spot that showed up in one of the TVs that looked like a woman had like a rash on her face. And all of the other TVs produced it very natural looking. It was like some shadow detail and skin tone. And that one I had to acknowledge because it was really obvious. But these kinds of differences do show themselves much more plainly and clearly on test patterns than they do on real world content. And because we saw the test patterns, I think it probably did bias us a little bit toward trying even harder to find that on the content, that if we were doing more of a casual viewing, we never would have noticed. But that's part of the competition. You are trying to identify differences. You're trying to make sure that when someone gets the TV home and they put on their favorite movie, there's not going to be a moment in the middle of it they're like, oh my God, what did it just do? You don't want it to fail spectacularly at anything. And I think that was the strongest thing on the Panasonic, is that it didn't fail spectacularly at anything. It didn't necessarily have the top scores in every category, but it looked good on all content. And it didn't have a lot of these little nuanced like artifacts that you could see that definitely brought the scores lower on some of its competitors.
So Brandon, while all this was going on, you're there, you're watching it all happen. You're maybe not as close to the TV as Chris was, but what was your sense of the room and how it was happening and how it was orchestrated and kind of your general thoughts of the day?
Well, yeah, I mean, again, I think it's an interesting dynamic, this entire shootout, because it's put on by a bunch of good people that are, donating their time and energy, and, maybe people are being employed to work there and do things and stuff. But I think the point is that I think everyone has good intentions, but it seems like once, that it's still, whether it's struggles or, issues with calibration, to calibrating them, and then issues with how others may perceive the TVs that may be different than the people that set them up, or the people that are there, or the judges may see them differently. Even though they're looking at the same thing, a judge may see it differently. It seemed like in the previous events that I've been to, that there's some discrepancies and some differences of opinions on what should be the way they're shown or the way that they're viewed and the outcome. And so it still had some of that to it, in that not everything looked and sounded perfect in the room. And there was, there's a lot of conversations going on, and even just getting kind of the pulse on what people thought. I felt like it sounded like the Panasonic kind of was in the lead the whole time. I felt like everyone was kind of feeling the Panasonic TV. And I think that's, like Chris said, a testament to its consistency. But, then again, it's hard for anyone but the judges to see what really shined when you're looking like, oh, that part is really good on this TV. And so therefore, like contrast grayscale on the Samsung and SDR and the Sony, look, they have really good scores there. And Panasonic just was, relatively good in everything, but didn't excel in anything comparatively. And so I got kind of the vibe that it was a Panasonic and Sony kind of, race to the top. And then toward the end, I was actually even thinking the Panasonic was going to win this. I was like, I just feel like the Panasonic's going to win, just kind of hearing things. And then for them to end in third place and for it to be this close, it was interesting. I felt like you spend a lot of time and effort, and then the results come out, and then it's not maybe exactly as you expect. And then was it all done right then? did we have too many judges? Did we calibrate them to the exact points? Did we overdo things? Was it too long and too tedious for the results from earlier on to shine through to the end, or was it rushed at the end? Kind of just those kind of thoughts. And I heard a lot of people talking about things like that. And again, not pointing fingers at anyone, just more like interesting, maybe not as people had thought it would, finish. But at the same time, I don't think it's like unfair to say that the Sony, Bravia 8 Mark II isn't a great TV. It is a great TV. And that's how it shook out today. They won the day. So it's just interesting.
I mean, the fascinating part for the people that are listening on the audio podcast is Panasonic did win more categories, 4 of the 8 total categories on the published scorecard. And Sony won 2 of the individual categories. And so I think that's a strange anomaly that TV wins in basically half the categories, but comes in third. And the Samsung won 2 of 8 categories and Sony won 2 of 8. And they were the neck and neck 0.03 of a point separating the two. But it looks like the bright room viewing for the Samsung really lifted them, gave them the advantage because they had some lower below 4 scores. And some of the other categories.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That leads me to one other thing, and I'm kind of talking a lot about this, so I apologize. But the scoring system in itself was a topic of conversation after the event. And, was the scoring and just giving judges, a 5-1 score with half-point increments as a reference good enough to make this an even system? And I think what I recommended or thought about and kind of relayed to some people was, it seems like when you have something like this with 4 TVs and you have 16 categories and you're trying to figure out what is, I guess, not just the best between them, but the best up against that reference monitor, is a system like ranked choice voting system going to be more even across 16 categories where it's 5, 4, 3, 2, and you just rank them in all the categories and then they come out with an even structure, as opposed, or even could you have a tie in a category, but then you have to go 5, 5, 3, 2, as opposed, just a way in which you can't get, like, for example, this maybe the bright room score for the Samsung, almost a 4.5 compared to some of the, because like you said, is a Sony at a 4.41 for contrast grayscale. If you give that, if it's 0.6 points ahead of the Panasonic, and that, it's very hard to come back to that, even if you win 4 of the 8 other categories. So that range that you're talking about, that's like, who made that up and how accurate can that be? And if this was scored in a ranked choice, would Sony come out on top still? It's just interesting to me. I don't know if it's any better or worse, but.
Yeah, no, it kind of reminds me of how they score maybe diving or ice skating or something. Don't they like throw out the high and the low score and then they average the middle and then something to that effect? And what would have changed had they done that? But I think everybody but Sony is asking that question. Sony's quite happy with the results.
Sony's pretty happy with the way things went. Yeah,
but yeah, Chris, what are your thoughts on the
Well, I think scoring? It's something that's come up in the past, and not in this, but I've been a part of other showdown type events like the Projector Showdown in projectorscreen.com, which they do things differently. I think it's more of a ranked choice system. But should some of these categories have higher weight than others? Like, is contrast the most important? Should it get a 1.2 rating, right? That it becomes more heavily weighted. Does SDR content matter as much as HDR content? And that is a judgment call. It's not clear that it does matter as much as HDR, particularly with most of the content moving toward the HDR and 4K direction. So these are questions that yet could be answered. I mean, I think the ideal scorecard would be one where you could go in and you could rank what's important to you, and then it would dynamically adjust the scores based on that, give weighting to the categories that you like most, and it would say your winner is the Panasonic, your winner is the LG. Your winner is the Samsung. Bright room performance is most important to me. That's a little technically hard to implement. I mean, it's not that hard, but you could do it in an Excel spreadsheet probably. But I think what they're trying to do here is simplicity. There's one winner, unless two had the exact same score overall, which hasn't happened yet. But they're trying to just say, okay, based on all these tests, and the Sony won it. But Robert always makes a point of saying, look at the scorecard, look at the individual values. You may find that Brightwood performance is more important. You may find you don't care about SDR content. Your favorite may not be the one that got the king of TV. Right. So I think he's trying to make it as legit and as honest as he can. I think he's trying to do the right thing for sure.
And I think everyone can point to the bias of the cited test. Everybody knew which model was which, and if they had any preconceived notions or they wanted to favor a brand, they could, because it's clear which brand was which. So I mean, that's always going to factor into a non-double blind test, which is super hard to do.
It is, because the TVs all have different operating systems, and as soon as you pull up the menu of any one of them, like, oh yeah, that's Fire TV, that's the Panasonic, that's Google TV, that's the Sony. So they couldn't have fooled us unless they had masked out the entire area of the screen around the screen, like the frame, the bezel was gone, and they never pulled up a single menu. I mean, some people might not have known which is which, but most of us have seen enough TVs that you just bring up the menu once, you know exactly which one it is. That's Tizen, that's WebOS, that's Google TV, that's Fire TV.
And you literally have to leave the room when they change from one thing to another. Otherwise, just the screens in between, you could tell that, what it comes in and out. And to your point earlier about reference monitors being Sony's, you have to remember the DVD player was a Panasonic. So there you go. Right.
So we got that logo on screen.
Fair.
Yeah. We had that logo up most of the day.
Panasonic had their input device. So there you go.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they were originally going to use a magnetar, and apparently that was not behaving very well. So they switched over to the Panasonic. So they didn't want to have a brand bias on the source, but came down to it. They had to.
Another thing that
Kaleidoscape a lot too, though.
Another thing that we looked at is if you did not round to the second decimal, then we started looking at the numbers, and it looked that if you did that, if you rounded it, it would be Sony would still have won by like a 0.1 as opposed to it being 0.03. So because I think it was just the first year that they've rounded to 2 decimals. I'm not sure.
No, I think they've always published the scores that way. Yeah, okay, I mean, from what I can remember, I'd have to go back and check my notes.
Yeah, and it's probably more accurate just to have the exact number anyways, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, so how many other YouTubers were part of the judges? Is anyone want to, like,
I don't think any YouTubers
do people know the judges?
judges.
Like, do we know who the judge? I mean, we know Chris was a judge, but the other 8 judges are people. I don't want to question anyone's ability to rate anything, but is that a topic of conversation amongst?
Well, not so much. I think they've done a pretty good job bringing in people who are TV reviewers, technology journalists. Nilay Patel was there from The Verge in his second year. I think after the shootout last year, he bought an 895L. He was that impressed with the Sony OLED. David McKenzie, who's a compressionist, he actually does the mastering. He authored the Spears and Munsell disc, so he's got a lot of experience looking at reference monitor screens and making sure that the colors are accurate and the performance is good. Avi Nirvana, Todd Anderson was there. I think a lot of the other judges were calibrators. They were ISF calibrators, like John Rafamato and
okay, so highly qualified people were judging. This was not...
But also content creators, like there was a director. There are people who are in video-related lines of work, but not necessarily TV reviewers, but they have a good eye for color, I would say. And
I'm curious if good friends of the show, Caleb Dennison, I know was he there this year?
No,
Caleb, I tried to get Caleb to come. I called him a couple times, but that whole legal dispute is still ongoing, and he's not clear on what he can do, talk about. It's a very sorry situation. We've reported on that in the past, and he has a GoFundMe to help with the legal expenses, which we will, I'm sure, include in the show notes and in the comments on YouTube. he was not there. Of course, FOMO and Brian's Tech Therapy were there. They were in their own room in the back, sweating profusely, apparently, because the AC didn't make it past the curtain into the back room. And so they might have suffered even more than we did in the main room.
Yeah, they had some pretty cushy seats though, man. I wouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You check them out.
They had some Valencia or some other similar type, reclining chairs back there. So it was definitely warm, but they did a good job. And yeah, you had mentioned Cecil, Class C Calibrations was one of the judges. Again, a very qualified, he's a very qualified calibrator, very smart dude.
And very level-headed.
I would say that. Yeah. But I'd say I heard enough people kind of talking in between all the different judges saying that they did or didn't like certain things. And, judges were talking to each other and people have opinions. And so, I think they're definitely qualified and everyone did a great job. But I just think, if you want to make it as fair as humanly possible, having some, actual scoring system and kind of the metrics and all the different calibration techniques and all the things that are going to be done kind of published ahead of time and stuck to and really like look at it from a more technical standpoint and maybe not have it as nuanced day to day, or maybe I would say this openly, I think it's difficult. It's difficult, but I think everyone did the best they could. I just think that, there's a lot of thought put into it too, but, having a lot of this public would be good ahead of time. And then it shakes out how it shakes out on the game day is kind of probably best for everybody. And so to that effect, if that's what happened, good deal. But the scoring system seems like it, maybe it could be streamlined a little better. And hopefully next year, maybe we can get it where the judges can input it into an electronic device and it spits out the answers a little quicker at the end too, because that was another kind of like tedious operation there. Is scoring this takes a while, and it's just we got out of there by about 8 p.m. It was pretty late, late evening.
Yeah, we got there at 9:30 and got out at 8. And I guess a few of you probably went on dinner afterwards. I just drove home and collapsed.
Yeah,
because it was it's exhausting. You don't think looking at TVs for 8 hours is going to be tough, but your eyes are just going. They're your irises or pupils are dilating, and then they're restricting because somebody opens the door, and then they turn on the lights accidentally, whatever. So yeah, it's a little. It takes more energy than you would think, particularly in a not super well air conditioned space.
At least there wasn't a second day of mini LED and or 8K TVs
or giant TVs or anything else.
No second day is probably a smart idea. In the end, I think get the best 4 or 5 TVs up there, shoot it out, boom. Maybe a little less time next year, but hey, still worthy event, and I appreciated being there.
Yeah, I mean, definitely grateful to Robert Zone, Value Electronics for putting this on. Tremendous amount of work, underappreciated how difficult it is to get these TVs calibrated, set up, and all the judges there. And I don't think the judges were paid. Chris, can you comment on judging and anything to that effect?
Yeah, I've been covering it since 2011. And I've filled in as a judge sometimes if somebody didn't show up, like particularly on the second day. This year, he invited me to judge, and I said, what the hell, I'll be one of the judges. There was no money involved. I think for people coming in from out of town, he covered the hotel expenses. Is that right? Brandon, he helped you out with the hotel, right?
Oh, yeah. Robert's great in that manner and like much appreciated. But yeah, it was, it was just very helpful to know the area and all that. But yeah, as far as that goes, yes.
Right. So the manufacturers don't have any input on this, really. They don't pay for a position. They don't sponsor it. But that's one of the things I didn't like about Company Space when they were doing it with DealerScope in the past, is that DealerScope would solicit, donations from all of the participants and, in order to pay for the event and pay for the venue. So that would at least lead to the perception of less credibility, even though it wasn't necessarily an actual problem. But bringing it back to Value Electronics, bringing all the TVs out of his own personal stock, probably paying Dwayne to do the calibration. I don't think he does the calibrations for free. I could be wrong. Maybe he does. But the judges don't get paid anything for their time. We come because we love this stuff. We love seeing the TVs, playing with them. I don't get the opportunity to put these 4 TVs all next to each other at the same time. Most of these manufacturers only give you the TV for a fixed amount of time, and you got to send it back. And, my little house, my little cabin, I don't have enough for 4, all next to each other. So I love that opportunity to be able to see some really cool content on all 4 TVs at the same time and really get a sense of what the differences are. And any one of these on their own, if you're looking at it, you're not going to see a lot of these differences. And you're probably going to be more generous because you're like, oh, it looks great. It's only when you compare them to each other that you see what the shortcomings are and the strengths are of some of the other models.
Right.
And even in the back, if you looked at FOMO and Brian's live stream, they had the 4 of them there with a good HDR content from like Jennifer Gala's channel. I mean, that looked remarkable back there. And all 4 of the TVs looked remarkable. So again, you'd be happy to have any of these,
I think they had the 55s in the back, right? The 55 inch?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I know like the chatter on the internet and there's other stuff happening. Is there anything that we didn't cover that they're going to yell at us in the comments about that
Yes.
you're hearing? And I know, Brandon, you've done your own video on this, which we haven't seen or will be released before this. Is there anything you want to talk about in that before we wrap this up?
No, I guess my main takeaway, if I can remember, this video is going to come out tomorrow. Eric's working on it now. As consistency, I definitely think that the Sony and the Panasonic, in my opinion, were most consistent. The Samsung had some really good highlights and then kind of struggle in other categories. So for me, it's less consistent. I don't, it gets like you said with the diving scores, do you kind of scratch the highest and the lowest scores? And then again, when it comes down to it, I've had more connectivity issues with Samsung TVs and kind of the Dolby Vision stuff that kind of turned me off on that. So it's more, I think it's fine. I think, listen, congratulations to Sony. I think it's a remarkable TV. But then again, there's no 77 inch. So, for me, I don't have a 65 inch TV in this house, like that's not happening. So, and at the same time, I was very impressed with the Panasonic. And its availability is more challenging in the States. You can get on Amazon, I think, and maybe some other stores, but not in the biggest retail stores, some of the Best Buys and all that. So those are some things, that has nothing to do with this event, and there's probably a lot more of those. Definitely surprised to see LG G5 just get crushed across the board. And in my video, I pointed out that there was no representative from LG at the event. Could that have helped to better calibrate the TV or get it to a point it needed to be? Could it have helped with the perception of it being a top tier TV to have representation at the event? I don't know. I mean, that's not for me to decide. I just found it interesting that the LG with no representative there got crushed. And from what I heard earlier on in the year, it felt to me like it was already going to be perceived as the best TV in 2025 before it came out. So, perception isn't reality all the time. And I guess the same goes for Sony in SDR because it looks like it won.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one last point, you didn't really talk about this, but could there be variances in the manufacturing? Because these are just out-of-the-box samples, and every TV may not come out perfectly. Have you, just curious, Brandon, have you come across that in all the TVs you reviewed where you can't review it, you have to send it back, or there's some anomaly that happens more often than you might think?
Well, I mean, I think there's definitely issues with TVs, especially early in the year without certain firmware updates and things like that. You can have TVs that work differently in the beginning of the year than from the end of the year. I mean, my Samsung S95F wasn't working in HDR. I don't know what I was doing wrong with it, but that would have, taken more time and effort to figure it out. And it's something that I notated in my video, but it sounded like from my knowledge, it sounded like the LG had its own issues, and maybe it could have been figured out before the contest. And maybe that led to the scores being worse than they were. I'm not certain that's 100% accurate. I'm just kind of like hearing the chatter. I'm not. So it's just interesting that TV seemed to be looked at as going to be a very good TV in 2025. And the Panasonic is a very similar pattern with better processing, but look at the scores. I mean, it crushed it in every category. So how could the G5 be that bad as a flagship, So it's just interesting to me. I don't know. There's no fault to be assigned anywhere. It's just kind of an observation from me looking at it from a not being a judge or a calibrator or really involved in the event, but just more covering it.
Chris?
Yeah, I would think that, because of the judges skew toward calibrators. And like I said, I think 3 if not four of the judges actually do professional calibrations. If they had seen anything on the LG that didn't match their own personal experience when calibrating those TVs, they probably would have spoken up about that. So I don't think you can write off the LG's performance as just a sample problem that was unique to that one TV and in that one sample of that TV. I know that there had been some Dolby Vision issues with LG G5 early on that were, I think, fixed in a firmware. So honestly, I think if I were going to go out on a limb, I would say many of the problems on the LG would probably be addressable with software updates. So the way that TV performs in 6 months might actually be a lot better than it performs right now. But it's been out long enough that shouldn't be an issue, right? The Panasonic is probably the last of those to hit the market, and it just seems more finished. It seems like its processing was more reliable. The Sony, of course, has been out for a little while as well. I think the other three, had been out on the market a little bit longer than the Panasonic has. Now, does that mean that they rushed the LG to market a little sooner than they should have? Maybe. I'm not going to make any value judgments there. I'm just going to speculate that's a possibility. But the net effect was that whatever limitations that it has, even if they are fixable in software, if they don't do a value electronic shootout part 2 follow-up 6 months later, right. I don't know if I'd even go to that. Once a year is good enough for me.
It sure is.
But it's kind of a moving target with TVs, right? When they first come out, they may have all these issues. How many times have I updated a TV review 4 months, 5 months, 6 months later to say, hey, we tested this, works now. Artings does that all the time. Ratings, however you pronounce it. They do that as well. They have a change log of their reviews because it comes out, scores like this. Firmware. Oh, guess what? It's better or it's worse. And this is what happened. Mm-hmm. And now that's what it is. Everything. Car reviews, speaker reviews, TV reviews, they're always a moving target. Maybe not speaker reviews as much because it's a mechanical thing. It's kind of hard to change that with software.
Well, don't forget about break-in. You can have break-in on your speakers.
Yeah, and wireless speakers. I mean, you could update functionality in a wireless speaker. But that's I think is, it's part of the challenge here is that it's like I said, a little bit of a moving target. The TV comes out. It may be very different in its performance 6 months later.
Well, I think we have covered it on this Value Electronics 2025 TV Shootout. I'm sure we missed something, and we'd love to hear from you in the comments. I want to thank Be The Installer. So grateful to have you on the podcast for the first time. Really fun to have this. As always, Chris, Mr. Editor at Large at eCoustics, thank you for that. Like, subscribe, comment wherever you are, and we'll see everybody next time. Bye.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Super successful channel. How did this all start for you?
Well, so it's been a wild ride. I had been a TV installer for 15 years, I think, at the time that I started YouTubing. And we kind of got, into the smaller jobs, not like, big integration jobs, but more just people needed TVs, unfortunately, over their fireplaces and, in other areas of their houses. But, I'm kind of a combination of a handyman and, tech guy, worked at Circuit City, and so kind of just a little bit of everything. And after about, so let me say this again. So I started by installing my first TV when a friend asked me to come over on a Sunday morning for football and said, hey, I'll give you $150 if you put my TV up. And I said, sold. Hey. And I went and did it. And then I started, getting some Craigslist jobs and eventually, full on, handyman / TV installer for years. And then I had an opportunity to install TVs for a lot of famous people in San Diego and also some YouTubers in San Diego. And one of them was an interior designer that had almost 1 million subscribers that asked if I had any content. And I unfortunately said I didn't really have any content at the time in 2019. And they said, hey, well, the video in which, you're in here now is going to be up in 3 weeks. You have 3 weeks to put some videos together if you want to get a shout out. So I did that. I hired someone to make a couple little videos. One of them was my little intro video, 45-second intro. One of them was a little Sonos review in which I kind of generally went over the Sonos products. And another was an installation of a video that was a TV mount on at Costco that I just kind of showed people how to install. And so those are the videos I made. It led me to the whole YouTube, down the rabbit hole of making videos on my own. And yeah, I had a couple of videos early on that were installation style videos that became pretty popular. But really COVID hit and I was kind of like monetized. This is going to be the thing for me for a while because of COVID. And then I had my first video, which was just hiding your wires, that went, parabolic right around like October, November of my first year of YouTubing, that earned quite a bit of money and kind of solidified this as what I wanted to do. So, I took my good old Trump check from 2020 and bought a LG C10 and never looked back after reviewing that TV as my first TV.
Wow. So
Nice.
From do-it-yourself sounds like you taught yourself how to install TVs. Then,
more or less. Yeah. I mean, I was a construction worker building bridges back in the day in college. So when I went through college, that was my summer job, working for a company my dad was a foreman for. And so I had some knowledge, but yeah, some of it was kind of learn on your own. And so then got into the YouTube. And then, of course, Jen is now a big star on the channel too. My wife, Jen, helps me Vanna White the TVs and like helps show off them and, has now become the master with regards to unboxing and peeling the plastic. So definitely a draw on the channel as well. Having the old family on the screen too.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, it's amazing that your whole family does this now. You review the biggest TVs, you get millions. I counted 16 videos with over 1 million views right now. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
that's pretty
amazing.
cool.
That's amazing.
Yeah. I think that's one thing when it comes to YouTube is, kind of reinventing the wheel. So, kind of like, or at least just, knowing what the audience wants to see. And that's what we try to do, just to, have a little bit of fun at the same time, trying to be as serious as we can about all the tech.
Right.
Could be a challenge. I'm sure you guys know.
Uh-huh.
I mean, you make it look easy. You make it look fun. You show how you bring it in the house and get it into their room. And I think even having your TV hung is the underrated story that I think of these flagships, or at least 50% are probably going to be hung, or maybe even higher than that. And
Well, probably not the 115s too much, but
They can be. They're just
can be.
really hard to do.
115s, yeah.
No, I mean, I don't really install a lot of TVs any longer. Just we don't have the time to. But I've taken a couple of 98 inches and donated them to friends and family that have done that it, like coaches of my kids and things like this. I just show up with the 98-inch TV and do a video on that. So that's
Nice.
fun, and they have a lot of excitement. Sometimes they don't want to be in the video, so it makes it a little harder to make it as fun. But still, there's one where I gave a 98-inch to a coach right before the Super Bowl. Unfortunately, his Chiefs lost this year, so after he took there's still a lot of comments, "Go Eagles" and all that in there. So
Did he smash the TV out of anger?
No, he better not have. That was a QM8 from last year, man. That's an awesome TV.
Yeah, no. Sweet.
yeah, I mean, no, it's amazing. You make it look so easy. You just kind of turn on the camera. You're supernatural and great personality on screen. So, I mean, yeah,
There's
your
a bunch of
content-
he said, she said. Well, no, just like that's what he said.
Yeah,
Joe.
I mean,
I've
Jen
seen a
is
couple of those.
amazing. Your wife, Jen, is amazing. Like she, I think, yeah. I mean, I would guess she's one of the most viewed women in tech. I mean,
I'm sure Justine might have her beat by, but still.
yeah.
But yeah, no, I'm glad. I appreciate it. Thank you for the kind words. I'm glad it looks as effortless as you say it does. The behind the scenes of the videos are pretty hilarious. And we are a married couple, so there's a little more daggers that are thrown once in a while than you might think.
I'm sure.
But maybe that's a testament to Eric over here that makes it look so seamless, right, Eric?
Looking forward to the Netflix miniseries on Inside Be the Installer.
Yeah, cool. No.
He was murdered by his wife.
And now we have the intro.
Yeah.